Now, we're at the point just prior to the flood. God sees that the line of believers has been contaminated through intermarriage with the line of unsaved man. And so God reacted by indicating he will give a timeline for the judgment of the first earth, the first world. The judgment will come 120 years from this point. In Noah's 600th year, God will bring the judgment of the flood. But here in verse 3, the Lord makes an interesting statement. It says again, "And Jehovah said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Now, what does God mean that his spirit shall not always strive with man? Well, let's take a look at a couple of words more closely that are used in this verse. For instance, the word strive. Strive is number 1777 in the Hebrew in Strong's Concordance, and it's a word that is translated as judged or plead the cause, and also strive. For instance, in Genesis chapter 30, verse 5, it says, "And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and has also heard my voice, and has given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan." Now, the English word judge is one of the more difficult words in the Bible to fully understand, because depending on the particular Hebrew word that's used, translated as judge or judgment, it could have several meanings. It could be a positive or a negative. And in this case, when Rachel, whose handmaid conceived and bore this son, she is calling his name Dan because God has judged her. She doesn't mean because God has punished her or God has done something to pour out his wrath upon her. It doesn't have that idea at all. It has to do with God hearing her pleas, hearing her prayers. And remember, this word judge is also translated pleading the cause. So basically, Rachel is saying, God has pleaded my cause. So she named his name Dan, which means judge or judgment. Also in Jeremiah 22, verse 16, he judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well with him. Was not this to know me, saith Jehovah. Now again, the word judge the cause is our word 1777, and it's not used negatively here at all. When someone judged the cause of the poor and needy, that is, like a judge hearing the case. They took into consideration and considered the cause for the poor and needy. It's actually maybe better understood. It's practically the same verse as Jeremiah 22:16, but using different wording for our word 1777. In Proverbs 31, verse 9, it says, "Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy." That's the same word. It could have been translated and judge the cause of the poor and needy. But here, plead the cause of the poor and needy. And who are the poor and needy? Well, God typifies those that he saves. They're poor in spirit. They're needy of salvation. It is language that the Lord ties in with his people, the elect. And to plead the cause of the poor and needy is a very positive thing, a very good thing. And so, when we're reading here in Genesis 6, as Jehovah said, my spirit shall not always strive, that's our word, which can properly be translated, my spirit shall not always plead the cause with man. That is, God is not always going to make salvation available. He's not always going to be concerned about a poor and needy people, his elect, because there will come a time when he has found all the poor and needy, a time when the lost sheep of the house of Israel have all been recovered. So here God is indicating, my spirit will not always strive, or my spirit will not always plead the cause with man, for that he also is flesh. in the King James translation, he also is flesh, is not delivering or presenting the idea that this Hebrew word carries. It's sort of interesting. It's translated differently every time it's used. But at least the other words, erred, sin ignorantly, deceived, and went astray, all have a sort of relationship. We can see how they identify with sin. To err from the right way of the commandments of God, to sin ignorantly, of course, has to do with sin. To be deceived, well, man's heart is deceitful because of sin. And to go astray. Before I was afflicted, I went astray from the way of God's commandments. And that idea of some sinful connection is missing from the King James translation. And that's why I said it's not the best translation. So when God says, going back to Genesis 6 verse 3, and Jehovah said, my spirit shall not always strive or plead the cause with man, for that he also is flesh. It should read, and I think this would be the better translation, for that in erring he is flesh. You see, now God is, in a way, defining what flesh will be from this point on. Flesh will have identification with erring or going astray or being deceived or sinning. When we read the rest of the Bible, that is what comes across. And so, when we're reading here in Genesis 6, my spirit will not always plead the cause with man, for that in erring he is flesh.